Hey guy, welcome back to Oops All History. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly into a world that feels half familiar, half like something out of a spooky old painting. We're talking about mental health in medieval times. And don't worry, this isn't going to be dark and heavy in the modern sense. No late-night therapy bills, no endless scrolling through self-diagnosis websites. Instead, it's a calm wander through how people centuries ago understood their minds, their moods, and the mysterious fog of human emotions. So, picture yourself sitting by a smoky fireplace in a stone hall, a wooden mug of warm ale in your hand, and outside it's raining on the cobblestones. The world is quiet, except for the occasional sound of a donkey braying somewhere in the distance, and you're about to hear how medieval folks explained sadness, anxiety, joy, madness, and all the strange states of mind that we today file neatly under mental health. Back then, the idea that you had a mind at all was already kind of fuzzy. Most people thought of the soul, the spirit, or maybe some humor sloshing around inside you. If you were feeling cheerful, that might mean your blood was warm and balanced. If you were gloomy, well, maybe your black bile was acting up. Yes, black bile. Nothing like blaming your bad Monday mood on some imaginary goo sloshing around your insides. And if that wasn't enough, religion was always standing in the corner, nodding knowingly. Feeling anxious, maybe it was the devil poking at you. Feeling a little too happy, careful, that might be sinful pride creeping in. Medieval people lived in a world where every mood was tied to something bigger: angels, demons, sin, holiness, or maybe just too much cheese before bed. Imagine, for example, a farmer trudging home after a long day in the fields. His back hurts, his head aches, and he's snapping at his wife. Today, we might say he's stressed, or maybe depressed. But in the 1300s, someone might tell him his humors were out of balance, or that he hadn't prayed enough. Or if they were really feeling bold, that he'd been cursed by that suspicious neighbor with the squinty eye. And when things got really bad, like someone wandering around town shouting at invisible enemies, or refusing to eat, or lying motionless in bed for days, that was when explanations really kicked into high gear. Was it madness from the humors? Was it punishment from God? Or maybe a witch had cast a spell? Medieval communities didn't really separate mental health from the spiritual and physical worlds. Everything blended together. Now, I want you to relax, breathe slowly, and imagine the rhythm of medieval life. People didn't have psychiatrists, or even the word psychology, but they did have healers, priests, herbalists, and neighbors full of advice. Some remedies were surprisingly gentle, like giving someone calming herbs, or suggesting a pilgrimage to clear the spirit. Others were less gentle. Think chaining someone up in a cold room until the spirits left them, or dunking them in icy water to shock the madness away. Nothing like a medieval spa day, except with way fewer scented candles. But let's not rush. We're going to take this slowly, like a story by the fireside, letting the old beliefs and strange treatments drift past us like smoke. Tonight isn't about judging or comparing. It's about sinking into the past, hearing what life was like, and gently noticing how far humanity has come in understanding the mysterious theater inside our own heads. So, lean back, close your eyes if you want, and let's begin wandering through medieval minds, one thought at a time. So, let's wander a little deeper into the medieval way of thinking. Imagine sitting in a small candlelit room, the air thick with incense, while a priest leans over a worn manuscript. You're not there for confession, you're there because your moods have been strange. Maybe you've been crying too much, or laughing at odd times, or perhaps you keep hearing whispers no one else can hear. The priest frowns, flips a page, and then tells you it could be a matter of sin, a temptation, or perhaps the influence of a wandering demon. Religion was the grand umbrella under which everything else in medieval life took shelter. If your crops failed, you prayed. If your child fell ill, you prayed. If your mind felt clouded, restless, or not quite right, then yes, you prayed even harder. People believed that your soul and your mind were so closely tied together that spiritual health and mental health were practically the same thing. And if that was the case, then the solution wasn't a psychiatrist, was confession, repentance, or sometimes even an exorcism. But it wasn't just religion alone. There was also the world of learned medicine, which in medieval Europe was still heavily based on ancient Greek and Roman ideas. The humors blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile were supposed to explain every mood and every illness. Too much black bile, and you might sink into melancholy. Too much yellow bile, and you might become angry or restless. Too much blood, and you could be overly cheerful or impulsive. And phlegm, well, if you were slow, lazy, or kind of apathetic, you might just be too phlegmatic. This was serious science back then, not just a fun personality quiz. Doctors would actually recommend treatments to rebalance you, like bloodletting, where they drained some of your blood to calm you down, or purging to flush out the bad humors, or diets designed to keep your mood under control. Imagine going to a doctor because you're feeling sad, and he prescribes fewer onions and more figs. It sounds strange to us, but to them, food and mood were directly linked. And let's not forget the herbs. Medieval healers had whole gardens of plants they swore could soothe troubled minds. Chamomile for calming, lavender for peace. St. John's wort, even back then, was thought to lift melancholy. If someone was restless or plagued by bad dreams, they might tuck herbs under their pillow, or boil them in a little drink before bed. Honestly, that part doesn't sound so bad. Herbal tea and aromatherapy are still popular today. Of course, not every remedy was so gentle. There were harsher methods too. Some believed that a troubled mind needed to be frightened back into order. A sudden shock, a plunge into icy water, or even tying someone up in a dark room until they snapped out of it. In those cases, the line between care and cruelty was very thin. But medieval society wasn't entirely heartless. Families often cared for relatives who struggled mentally, sometimes with patience, sometimes with frustration, but rarely with complete abandonment. Villages whispered. Of course, people always whispered, but they also often saw mental distress as part of life, something woven into the fabric of community. If someone wandered around muttering to themselves, they might be considered odd, or touched by God, or even carrying secret wisdom. Not every case was treated with fear. Some were met with curiosity, even a strange kind of respect. Picture a small town square. The market is bustling, chickens are running underfoot, and in the corner, there's a man who spends all day reciting verses or warning of doom. Today, we might see him as someone in the grip of paranoia or psychosis. Back then, people might call him a prophetor, a fool, but one blessed by God. In a world where miracles and saints were part of daily imagination, unusual behavior could sometimes be reframed as something sacred. And so, medieval mental health wasn't just about illness, it was about interpretation. Every strange mood, every unusual behavior, every outburst or silence was a story waiting to be explained. Maybe it was the stars, maybe it was God, maybe it was the humors, or the food, or the neighbors casting the evil eye. As you let yourself sink deeper into this quiet story, imagine the way people must have felt scared, maybe, but also comforted that there was always some explanation. No one thought the mind was just random chaos. It was always connected to something bigger. And in that belief, there was a strange kind of peace. Now, let's imagine what happened when mental struggles grew too overwhelming for families to handle. In medieval Europe, there weren't really hospitals in the modern sense, but there were places that tried to offer cure, at least containment. Some monasteries opened their doors to people who were considered disturbed or troubled in mind. These were quiet, stone-walled spaces filled with chants, candlelight, and the smell of old wood. The monks believed prayer, discipline, and silence could help bring peace to a wandering soul. In other towns, there were what we might call hospitals, though they were less about healing and more about shelter. People who had no family, or whose families couldn't cope, might be placed in these institutions. They weren't always cruel, but they were certainly strict. Chains, locked doors, and isolation were common. Imagine being restless and confused, and ending up in a cold room with only straw for bedding and the distant echo of church bells for company. Still, not all was bleak. Some religious orders believed in kindness and charity. They offered food, warmth, and gentle care. A troubled mind, they thought, was still a soul worth saving. Some monasteries became places of refuge, where someone could walk in from the chaos of the outside world and find a little peace, even if it was just a routine of prayer and simple meals. And then, there were the more creative solutions. Pilgrimages were a popular treatment. If someone was plagued by sadness or visions, their family might send them on a long journey to a holy site, walking miles upon miles to see a relic or touch a shrine. The journey itself was believed to cleanse the soul, and maybe, in the process, clear the mind. Imagine trudging through muddy roads, sleeping in crowded inns, and finally reaching a glowing cathedral filled with candles. Whether or not it helped, the ritual gave people hope, and sometimes that was enough. Astrology also had its part to play. Learned men believed the stars and planets influenced not just your fate but also your moods. Feeling anxious, maybe Saturn was in a bad position. Feeling too excitable, perhaps Mars was shining too brightly. Physicians would sometimes cast horoscopes to decide what treatment to give. In a way, this was their early form of therapy, explaining your emotions through the great clockwork of the sky. But let's not forget the role of the community itself. Neighbors, friends, and family members often stepped in with their own advice. Some swore by charms, little objects hung around the neck to ward off dark spirits. Others would burn herbs or recite prayers in the home. In rural villages, healers and wise women were often consulted. They might prepare potions, give calming teas, or mutter protective spells. The line between medicine and magic was very thin. Of course, this also meant that mental health troubles could sometimes be seen as witchcraft or possession. If someone behaved strangely, screaming in the night, refusing to eat, or speaking in a way that frightened others, suspicion could grow. Was this person cursed? Were they harboring demons? Most of the time, communities leaned toward care. But every so often, fear tipped the balance, and someone could be accused of darker things. And so, medieval mental health was a patchwork quilt of explanations and remedies. A little religion, a little medicine, a little superstition, and a lot of community gossip. Behind it all was the deep belief that every state of mind had meaning, that no one was ever just sad or just mad. There was always a reason, and with enough prayer, herbs, stars, or journeys, there might also be a cure. As you drift deeper into this story, let your mind wander the stone streets of a medieval town. Picture the flicker of torches, the sound of a bell calling people to prayer, and the sense that every human struggle was part of a greater, mysterious plan. It's a world both strange and familiar, where the heart and mind were never separate, but always woven into the soul. As we keep wandering through the medieval world of the mind, let's slow down and think about what melancholy meant back then. Today, we might call it depression, but in the Middle Ages, it was its own strange poetic state. Learned men wrote long, serious books about melancholy, as if it were both a sickness and a mark of genius. Too much black bile in the body, they said, would weigh the spirit down, making you sad, sluggish, and trapped in dark thoughts. Yet at the same time, some thinkers believed melancholy could also make you wise, even creative. The troubled mind, they thought, might see the world in a deeper way than others. Imagine a scholar sitting alone in his study, surrounded by dusty manuscripts, a candle flickering beside him. His eyes are heavy, his heart heavy too. He sighs, scribbles a few lines, and wonders if he's cursed with melancholy. To us, it sounds like burnout or depression. To him, it was part of the rhythm of life, something that could be soothed but never entirely erased. And for ordinary people, melancholy was still something they recognized, even if they didn't use the word. A farmer who lost his crops might sink into a gloom. A widow might feel crushed by grief for months, even years. These weren't seen as private illnesses, they were seen as natural parts of human existence, tied to fate, fortune, and faith. When sadness stretched on too long, though, people would worry that the balance of humors had gone dangerously wrong. The remedies for melancholy were often gentle. Physicians advised music, fresh air, good food, and the company of cheerful friends. Go sit in a garden, they said, or walk by running water. Eat ripe fruit, drink a little wine, listen to soothing songs. It almost sounds like modern self-care advice, except maybe with a medieval twist of leeches or bloodletting if things got really bad. But the idea that the environment could shape your mood was strong, and many believed that sunshine, green fields, and pleasant company could heal a heavy heart. Anxiety, too, had its medieval form. They might call it fear or restlessness, sometimes even a sign of weak faith. If you were pacing the floor at night, heart racing, unable to settle, a priest might tell you to pray harder, to place your trust in God. A physician might suggest calming herbs, or warm baths, or balancing your humors. A neighbor might simply shrug and say you'd been under the evil eye. But nights could be the hardest. Imagine lying in a narrow bed, in a dark wooden house, with the creaks of the beams above you, and the sighs of your family sleeping nearby. Your mind won't rest. You worry about money, or the harvest, or sins you never confessed. In those long medieval nights, the silence could feel endless. and fears could grow heavy. People believed that demons and spirits prowled at night, whispering to the restless. To guard against this, many hung charms above their beds or prayed before sleeping, asking for protection from nightmares and wandering thoughts. And then there were the moments when mental distress looked so dramatic that it couldn't be ignored. Someone screaming in the streets, tearing at their clothes, or collapsing in a fit. Epilepsy and seizures were often confused with madness or possession. Villagers might rush to hold the person down, or carry them to a church for a blessing. Physicians, if they were nearby, might diagnose an overflow of black bile, or too much heat in the brain. Explanations varied, but the fear and urgency were the same. Something had gone very wrong in the unseen world of the mind. Still, not everyone who struggled was treated with fear. There are stories of families carrying troubled relatives with them, never abandoning them, and communities allowing space for eccentric figures to wander, half respected, half pitied. Mental difference wasn't always hidden. A wheat often lived right in the heart of the village, part of daily life. And so, as you drift deeper into this story, you can almost feel the weight of medieval emotions, the sadness that was seen as wisdom, the fear that was tied to faith, the restless nights full of charms and whispered prayers. A world where every thought and feeling had meaning, where nothing in the mind was random, and where even sorrow could sometimes be seen as a gift. Now, let's step into the world of remedies that try to soothe the troubled mind. Picture a small wooden chest in a healer's cottage, filled with little bundles of dried plants: rosemary, sage, chamomile, lavender. These were not just for cooking or making the house smell nice. They were weapons against sadness, fear, and restless spirits. If you came to the healer saying you could not sleep, or your thoughts raced too much, you might be given a sachet of herbs to tuck under your pillow, or a cup of warm infusion to drink before bed. Some remedies were meant to comfort the senses. Sweet smells, calming tastes, and gentle warmth all played their part. A bath in warm water infused with herbs could be recommended to relax the body and, by extension, the mind. Imagine the steam rising, the dim light of a candle, and the feeling of tension slowly drifting away, very much like the medieval version of a spa day. But there were also more dramatic cures. Physicians sometimes advised purging the body of whatever excess humor they believed was disturbing the mind. This could mean strong laxatives, vomiting potions, or bloodletting. To us, that sounds alarming, but to them, it was a logical way of resetting the balance inside. If your black bile was too high and you were sunk deep in melancholy, a doctor might reach for his leeches with the confidence of someone prescribing aspirin today. And then there were charms, tiny objects worn for protection. A small cross, a string of beads, a piece of parchment with a sacred verse written on it. These were believed to shield the mind from evil spirits or from the envy of others. Sometimes, people even wore little amulets shaped like animals or plants, thought to draw away bad thoughts and keep the heart light. Music, too, was part of healing. The soothing sound of a harp or the chant of monks in a cloistered hall could work like medicine for someone struggling with inner storms. Many medieval texts recommend song and companionship for lifting sadness. Imagine being invited to sit by a fire while someone strums a lute and sings, the notes filling the room with warmth. For a moment, the world feels lighter, and the mind calm. Of course, not all treatments were so gentle or poetic. Some believed that frightening a person could jolt them back to normalcy. Sudden shocks, cold water, or even being tied up were sometimes used. These harsh methods remind us that medieval care could sometimes slip into cruelty, even when people meant well. Families desperate for answers tried almost anything, not out of hatred, but out of fear and helplessness. At the same time, prayer was woven into almost every approach. Whether you were sipping a herbal potion, walking on a pilgrimage, or wearing a charm, a prayer usually accompanied it. The belief that the soul and mind were inseparable meant that healing the spirit was just as important as healing the body. And so, the medieval mind existed in a world where every cure was a mixture of nature, faith, and ritual. A little lavender tucked beneath the sheets, a whispered blessing before bed, a prayer mumbled in the darkness. It was all part of the fabric of daily life. As you drift with this story, imagine the flicker of a candle, the smell of herbs drying in the rafters, and the sound of distant bells. In that world, even the smallest gesture could feel like medicine, and even if it didn't cure the mind, it comforted the soul. Now, Let's take a quiet walk into the social side of things, how medieval people treated those in their towns and villages whose minds worked a little differently. Not everyone was hidden away in monasteries or locked in hospitals. In fact, many lived right in the heart of their communities, woven into daily life in ways that might surprise us. Imagine a small medieval village, houses made of wattle and daub, smoke curling up from thatched roofs, chickens running about in the mud. In the square, merchants are calling out prices, children are chasing each other, and among them is a man who mutters to himself constantly. People glance at him, some laugh, some shake their heads, but most simply accept his presence. He's different, but he belongs here, just as much as the baker or the blacksmith. In many cases, the community absorbed people with mental struggles into its rhythm. They might be given small tasks, watching animals, fetching water, running errands that gave them purpose. Sometimes they were treated with kindness, even if mixed with a little pity. Other times, they were seen as fools, but fools who carried a kind of innocence. In fact, medieval culture often gave space to the idea of the holy fool, someone whose strangeness might be a sign of divine touch rather than sickness. Fools and jesters in noble courts were sometimes people who today we might recognize as neurodivergent or struggling with mental illness. Their unusual way of thinking, their odd remarks, their sudden moods, these could be turned into entertainment, but also into wisdom. Kings and lords sometimes valued their fools for speaking truths others were afraid to say. So in a strange way, difference could give someone a unique role, even at the highest levels of society. But acceptance always had limits. Fear lingered beneath the surface. If someone's behavior grew too disruptive, loud screaming in the night, violent outbursts, or speech that seemed frightening, neighbors might whisper about curses or demonic influence, this could quickly shift from tolerance to suspicion. A troubled soul might be cared for one day and feared the next. There were also traveling figures, wanderers who roamed from town to town, sometimes begging, sometimes simply drifting. Many of these were people whose minds were unsettled, who could not hold steady lives. Some were treated with compassion, given bread and a place to rest. Others were chased away, seen as dangerous or untrustworthy. Medieval people lived close to the edge of survival, and anyone who seemed unpredictable could stir unease. Still, stories survive of extraordinary patience and love. Families who carried on caring for their troubled members year after year, never casting them out. Villages where an eccentric man or woman became a familiar character, part of the town's identity. And behind it all was the belief that every soul mattered, even if it was troubled, even if it was strange. So, when we think about mental health in the Middle Ages, we shouldn't just imagine dark dungeons or cruel chains. We should also picture simple acts of kindness: a neighbor leaving food at someone's door, a priest offering prayers, a family adjusting their lives to make space for one restless heart. And as you drift deeper into this story, you can feel the warmth of that community fire, where people gathered close, whispering, laughing, worrying, praying, carrying their own burdens, yet all part of the same fragile world. Let's move a little closer now to the role of faith in the church, because in the medieval mind, there was no sharp line between mental health and spiritual health. To be troubled in your thoughts often meant to be troubled in your soul, and so priests, monks, and holy men became some of the first therapists people turned to. Imagine kneeling on the cold stone floor of a church, the air heavy with the smell of incense, the flicker of candles casting long shadows on the walls. You confess to the priest that you have been plagued by restless thoughts, by sorrow that will not lift, or by fears that chase you in the night. He listens, nods slowly, and then offers you advice not about medicine, but about prayer, penance, and the cleansing of your spirit. Perhaps you are told to fast for a time, to recite certain psalms, or to visit a shrine of a saint known for miracles of healing. Exorcism, too, had its place. Not always the dramatic kind we picture from movies, but sometimes quieter rituals of blessing and protection. Holy water sprinkled, prayers chanted, a sign of the cross traced over the troubled person's forehead. If the community believed a demon was whispering in your ear, the church had rituals ready to drive it out. To us, it may sound frightening, but to medieval families, this was hope that the mind could be cleared through the power of faith. And then there were relics, the bones of saints, pieces of clothing, fragments of wood said to come from the true cross. These objects carried power. Touching them, praying near them, or even carrying a small token of them could be thought to calm the mind and chase away despair. Families sometimes traveled long distances with their struggling loved ones, just for the chance to kneel before a relic and ask for healing. The church also provided sanctuary. Monasteries and convents could sometimes shelter those who were deeply troubled. The rhythm of prayer, work, and silence was believed to bring order to disordered minds. Picture a troubled soul rising with the monks at dawn, joining their chants, eating plain bread and soup, and ending the day with quiet candlelit prayer. For some, the steady rhythm may well have been a comfort, but faith could also cut the other way. If sadness was seen as sinful despair, if fear was seen as weak faith, then those struggling might feel shame piled on top of their burden. A priest might warn that their sorrow came from failing to trust God, and that could make the struggle heavier. And yet, even then, the church offered rituals, confession, absolution, blessings that gave people something to cling to. So, faith was both comfort and challenge, hope and pressure, but it was never absent. In the medieval world, to heal the mind without tending to the soul would have seemed impossible. And so, every prayer whispered, every candle lit, every relic touched, became part of the tapestry of medieval mental health. As you let yourself sink deeper into this story, imagine the hush of a medieval church at night. The air is cool, the stones ancient, and somewhere a monk's chant echoes softly. In that sound, medieval people found a kind of medicine, believing that the soul's peace could calm the restless mind. Now let's wander into the world of remedies, because medieval people didn't rely on faith alone. They had herbs, potions, and treatments, some surprisingly practical, others a little odd, and a few downright alarming. Imagine a medieval healer, maybe a wise woman in a village, or a physician trained in the great universities of Paris or Bologna. You come to them with a restless mind, with sorrow that won't lift, or with wild fits of anger. What do? Well, the first step might be to balance your humors. The body, according to medieval medicine, was ruled by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of one could throw off not just the body, but the mind. Melancholy, that deep sadness, was believed to come from too much black bile. So, treatments often aimed at adjusting these humors. Maybe bloodletting, to drain away the excess. Maybe purging, to clear the stomach. Not the gentlest methods, but rooted in the belief that restoring balance could restore peace. Herbal remedies were everywhere. Poppy seeds for calming, valerian for sleep, lavender to soothe the nerves, rosemary, sage, and chamomile were all thought to have effects on the spirit. A healer might brew you a bitter tea, or grind herbs into a paste, to be worn in a pouch around your neck. The smell alone, they believed, could protect the mind from troubling influences. Then there were charms, small objects, prayers written on scraps of parchment, or little amulets worn close to the skin. To us, they might look like superstition, but to medieval people, they were layers of defense against demons, against dark moods, against the unknown forces that tugged at the mind. Bathing was another remedy, especially in warm mineral springs. Some towns became famous for their healing waters, where the troubled could soak, rest, and, hopefully, emerge calmer. It's not hard to imagine why. A hot bath after a stressful day works for us, too. But not all remedies were so gentle. Some involved bizarre concoctions, mixes of animal parts, rare stones, or even dried blood mint, to shock the body back into balance. These might sound strange, even frightening, but they came from a world where people were desperate to ease suffering, willing to try anything that offered a glimmer of hope. And yet, there's something tender in these efforts. Families searching the woods for herbs, healers carefully preparing mixtures, mothers whispering charms over their children at night. Even when the science was misguided, the intention was love. So, as you picture medieval mental health, don't just think of chains and dark rooms. Picture also the scent of lavender crushed in a mortar, the warmth of a bath in a stone tub, the soft glow of an amulet hanging by a bed. Picture people doing their best, with the knowledge they had, to soothe troubled minds. And as you rest here with the story, imagine the gentle rustle of herbs drying in a cottage, the steam of a healing bath rising into the night air, the quiet hope that tomorrow the mind might be lighter. Let's drift now into the world of medieval hospitals and special places, where people with troubled minds might have found themselves. When we picture a hospital today, we imagine clean white walls, doctors with stethoscopes, and tidy rows of beds. Medieval hospitals were very different. They were often run by religious orders, monks, nuns, or charitable foundations. Picture long stone halls, the air heavy with incense, rows of wooden beds with straw mattresses, and nurses in habits moving quietly among the sick. The focus wasn't on cure in the modern sense, but on care, comfort, and above all, saving the soul. If a person came in with deep sadness, with raving speech, or with strange visions, they might be placed here. Their treatment would be a mix of prayer, simple herbal remedies, and the calm order of the hospital routine. The steady ringing of bells for prayer, the rhythm of meals, the chanting of Samsit, all created a structure that could be soothing, even if the underlying illness remained. Some hospitals, like those in big cities Paris, London, Florence, became well-known centers, attracting not just the sick in body, but also the troubled in mind. Records survive of patients described as melancholic, deranged, or possessed. Sometimes they stayed for weeks, sometimes for years. Of course, resources were limited. Hospitals could be overcrowded, understaffed, and far from gentle. Patients might be restrained if they became violent. Food was simple, often poor, and yet, compared to being left alone in the streets, these places offered a kind of refuge. Outside of hospitals, some cities created special houses, early asylums, though not in the sense we think of today. In London, by the 13th century, there was Bethlehem, later infamous as Bedlam. At first, it wasn't the chaotic madhouse of legend. It was a small priory hospital that admitted the mentally ill among others, giving them shelter and religious care. Only centuries later did it gain its terrifying reputation. So in the Middle Ages, to be mentally troubled didn't always mean banishment or cruelty. It could mean a place in a hospital bed, the care of a nun who prayed by your side, the daily rhythm of bells and candles. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was something. And perhaps there's comfort in imagining that scene. The stone walls cold but steady, the light of candles flickering on wooden beams, the quiet hum of monks chanting in the distance. In that space, even the most restless mind might find a little peace, if only for a moment. As you sink deeper into this story, you can picture yourself lying on that straw mattress, the smell of herbs nearby, a prayer whispered over you as the night slowly drifts on. Let's step now into the home, because most people with troubled minds were not in hospitals or monasteries. They lived right where they had always lived, among their families, in their cottages, by their hearths. And here, the story becomes one of quiet endurance, of households adjusting, sometimes with patience, sometimes with frustration, to a mind that wandered or a heart that felt too heavy. Picture a small timber-bird house, the fire crackling in the center, smoke escaping through the thatch. A family is gathered, parents, children, maybe grandparents, all under one roof. In the corner sits a brother who mutters to himself, or a daughter who stares into the flames with sad, distant eyes. The family works around them, making space, giving tasks when possible, and simply bearing their presence when not. Care in the home was often practical. A troubled soul might be given lighter work watching geese in the meadow, carrying water, tending the fire, something that kept them useful without overwhelming them. If they grew agitated, they might be calmed with a cup of warm ale, or a prayer murmured by their mother. If they sank into silence, someone might sit nearby, letting them drift until they stirred again. Of course, life was not always gentle. Poverty made patience hard. If food was scarce, if winters were long, if tempers grew short, a troubled family member could be seen as a burden. There are records of people being tied, confined, or even cast out when their behavior became too much. And yet, in other homes, remarkable tenderness shines through, families carrying the weight of care year after year, refusing to abandon their own. Folk remedies were often tried at home. A grandmother might hang a sprig of herbs over the troubled person's bed, or whisper charms into their ear at night. Sometimes the remedies were simple comforts, a soft blanket, a bowl of broth, the warmth of the fire. Other times, they were harsher purges, bleeding, or foul-tasting brews forced down in hope of chasing the sickness away. But more than remedies, it was the rhythm of family life that mattered. The steady cycles of work, meals, and prayers created a structure, and structure itself can be soothing. Even if the mind was restless, the body still rose with the dawn, still joined the others in the fields, still came back to the hearth at night. So much of medieval life was communal. People rarely lived alone. Families, neighbors, entire villages shared space and responsibility. and so, those with troubled minds were woven into that fabric, not hidden away, but present, part of the noise, the laughter, the arguments, and the prayers. If you close your eyes, you can imagine it, the dim glow of the fire, the murmur of voices, the smell of bread baking on the hearth. A troubled soul sits quietly in the corner, their family nearby, the weight of their care balanced by the warmth of belonging. And in that moment, you see that medieval mental health was not just about medicine or faith. It was about the small acts of ordinary life, sharing food, offering a blanket, sitting side by side through the long winter night. Now, let's think about how medieval people explained mental struggles to themselves, because every society has stories and reasons, ways of making sense of what they cannot fully understand. And in the Middle Ages, explanations could range from the natural to the supernatural, from the deeply wise to the deeply strange. One of the most common ideas was imbalance the humors again. Too much black bile, that was melancholy. Too much yellow bile, maybe that explained someone's sudden rages. It was a neat system, easy to remember, and it gave families and healers something to point to, even if the science wasn't quite right. But there were also explanations rooted in the unseen. Many believed troubled minds were touched by forces beyond the natural. Sometimes that meant demons. A person who screamed, babbled, or writhed might be seen as possessed, their body hijacked by evil. In those cases, the response was prayer, exorcism, holy water, the tools of spiritual battle. Other times, people saw divine purpose. A soul crushed with sorrow might be tested by God. A person who spoke in riddles or had visions might be blessed with prophecy. The line between madness and holiness was thin, and sometimes one could slip into the other. Saints' lives are full of people who saw visions, who behaved in ways that might today be labeled as symptoms, yet were revered for their closeness to the divine. There was also the ever-present whisper of witchcraft. In some cases, if a person's mind unraveled suddenly, neighbors wondered if a curse had been laid on them. A jealous rival, a spurned lover, a quarrelsome neighbor, maybe they had turned to dark arts. And so, treatments might involve breaking spells, using charms, or carrying protective amulets. Astrology, too, played a role. Learned physicians studied the stars, believing that the movement of planets could influence not just the body but the mind. A person born under a certain sign, or struck by illness when Mars was in the wrong place, might be fated for restlessness. Physicians sometimes drew up detailed horoscopes before prescribing treatment, as if the cure for sadness lay written in the sky. What's striking is how all these explanations coexisted. A troubled man in a village might be, at once, suffering from too much black bile, cursed by a witch, tested by God, and born under unlucky stars. The medieval world was comfortable holding many truths at once, weaving natural, spiritual, and cosmic ideas into a single tapestry. And in a way, there's something comforting about that. To live in a world where your pain was not meaningless, but always connected to heaven, to the earth, to the stars above. To know that your sorrow or madness was part of a bigger story, not just an isolated struggle. So, as you imagine the medieval night sky, scattered with stars, think of families looking up, wondering if the heavens themselves held the reason for their loved one's restless mind. And beneath those stars, in the quiet of the village, someone whispered a prayer, someone tied a charm, someone brewed a bitter tea, all trying, in their own way, to bring peace to a troubled soul. Let's take a gentle walk now into the medieval city streets, because the way mental health appeared in public tells us a lot about how people lived with it. Villages were small, familiar places, but cities were crowded, noisy, and bustling, perfect stages where the struggles of the mind became visible to everyone. Picture a marketplace in London or Paris, merchants shouting, donkeys braying, apprentices rushing with baskets, bells tolling in the distance. In the midst of this chaos, you might see someone wandering barefoot, muttering to themselves, hair wild, clothes ragged. People notice, some stop and laugh, others make the sign of the cross. A few toss a coin out of pity. These figures became part of the urban landscape. They were called fools, madmen, beggars, holy wanderers. Some frightened people, others became familiar faces. City records even mention individuals known for their strange behavior, nicknames attached to them as if they were characters in the story of the town. In some cases, these public eccentrics found a kind of safety net. A wealthy patron might give them a cloak. A merchant might let them sweep a shop in exchange for food. Neighbors might feed them scraps. But at other times, the city had less patience. Trouble with the law could follow fights started, windows broken, noise made in the middle of the night, and when that happened, the authorities stepped in. Medieval law codes mention the lunatic or the idiot, often with special rules. A person judged unable to manage their own affairs might have a guardian appointed. Property could be managed by relatives or the crown. In some cases, this protected the vulnerable. In others, it meant stripping them of independence. Public order mattered deeply in medieval cities. Anyone who disturbed the peace, whether through drunkenness, madness, or simple mischief, could be locked away temporarily. Sometimes it was just a night in a cell to let the storm pass. But repeated outbursts might mean confinement in one of the city's hospitals or almshouses. And yet, woven through these stern responses was a thread of tolerance. People knew their mad neighbors. They recognized their quirks. They gossiped about them, teased them, sometimes feared them, but they also lived alongside them. Madness was not invisible. It was part of the street, the market, the church steps. Think of it this way. In a medieval city, you could find the butcher, the baker, and the mad wanderer all standing side by side, each a familiar part of daily life. And perhaps that made mental illness less hidden than it often is today. It was seen, acknowledged, sometimes mocked, sometimes helped, but never completely out of sight. So as you imagine the medieval night settling over a cobbled street, picture the lanterns dimming, the voices fading, and somewhere, a solitary figure still wandering, muttering softly into the dark. The city around them sleeps, but they remain awake, a small reminder that the human mind does not always rest when the world does. Let's turn now to the noble, households and the courts of kings, because mental health was not just a problem for peasants or beggars. Lords, ladies, even monarchs themselves were vulnerable to the shadows of the mind. And when that happened, it shook entire kingdoms. Take the example of King Charles VI of France, sometimes called Charles the Mad. In the late 14th century, he began to suffer terrifying fits. He would lash out violently, sometimes attacking his own men. Other times, he refused to bathe or change his clothes for months. In one of his most famous delusions, he believed his body was made of glass, so fragile that he feared even to move, lest he shatter into pieces. His courtiers had to approach him gently, reassuring him that he was still flesh and bone. For an ordinary villager, such behavior might have led to confinement or care by family. But for a king, it meant political crisis. When the ruler of a nation could not trust his own mind, who would govern? Factions in the court fought for control, and wars were shaped by his instability. Mental illness at the top rippled through the whole realm, and Charles was not alone. Medieval chronicles record many nobles troubled in mind. Some withdrew from public life, sinking into melancholy that looked like endless mourning. Others grew erratic, their strange behavior whispered about in corridors and cloisters. Behind the grandeur of castles, there were tears, fears, and sleepless nights. Just like in any humble cottage, noble families sometimes tried to hide these struggles, treating them privately with physicians and priests. A troubled lord might be kept away from the public eye, tended in his chamber with herbs, prayers, and careful watch. A lady overcome with sorrow might retreat to a convent, where her melancholy could be framed as piety. But sometimes, the strangeness was too visible to ignore. Royal records even include financial accounts for caring for mad relatives, payments to attendants, special clothing, secure rooms. It shows us that mental illness was recognized, named, and managed, even if imperfectly. And in courts, fools and jesters played an interesting role. While often employed for entertainment, many were people who thought differently, who spoke in odd ways or behaved unpredictably. Their strangeness, which might have been a burden in another life, became a valued talent in noble circles. It's a reminder that sometimes, in the right place, difference was not only tolerated, but celebrated. So, mental health in the halls of power was a double-edged sword. It could be hidden, it could be spun into prophecy or piety, but it could also unravel alliances, shape wars, and alter history itself. As you rest with this thought, picture the torchlit halls of a medieval castle at night. Behind the heavy doors, a king trembles at shadows only he can see. A queen whispers prayers for her restless mind, and a fool dances clumsily, his laughter masking truths no one else dares to speak. let's drift into the world of monasteries and convents, because these religious communities were not only places of prayer, but also sanctuaries for troubled minds. For some, the cloistered life was chosen freely. For others, it became a refuge or even a place of gentle confinement when the outside world became too overwhelming. Imagine waking in a stone cell just before dawn. The air is cold, the walls bare, and the only sound is the soft tolling of a bell. You rise, join the others in the chapel, and chant psalms by candlelight. The rhythm of prayer marks every hour of the day: work, study, silence, meals, and more prayer. For a restless or troubled soul, this structure could feel like a bomb. The mind, chaotic and stormy, was steadied by the regularity of the cloister. Monks and nuns themselves sometimes wrote about struggles that today we might recognize as depression or anxiety. They called it acedia, a kind of spiritual weariness, a heaviness that settled on the soul and made prayer difficult. It was described as a noonday demon, striking in the middle of the day with boredom, despair, and restlessness. Monks might pace, yawn, feel unable to pray, or sink into sadness. The response was spiritual discipline, more prayer, manual labor, confession, and reading scripture. Brothers and sisters encouraged each other, believing that acedia was not just a weakness of the mind, but a temptation that could be resisted with faith. Yet in their writings, you can feel the rawness, the human struggle behind the holy words. These were people wrestling with loneliness, monotony, and sorrow. Convents became havens for noble women whose minds were troubled. Instead of being exposed to the chaos of court, they could retreat to a life of prayer. Sometimes this was framed as holiness, but often it was also practicality, a safe place where a family's daughter could live quietly, her struggles hidden behind cloister walls. And monasteries didn't only care for their own. Some took in outsiders, the sick, the poor, the mentally troubled. They might give them a bed for a time, food, and the healing rhythm of the monastic day. The belief was that in the presence of God, peace could be found, even for a restless mind. Of course, not every cloister was a gentle sanctuary. Strict discipline, endless repetition, and harsh fasting could worsen despair. But in many, there was a real attempt at care, rooted in the belief that no soul was beyond healing. Soul. As you imagine the medieval monastery at night, picture the cloister quiet under the moon, the echo of chanting fading into silence. A troubled monk lies awake in his cell, whispering prayers against the noonday demon, while outside the walls, the world sleeps. Let's wander now into the world of medieval stories and literature, because the way people told tales often reflected their understanding of the human mind. In their myths, poems, and plays, madness appeared again and again, not just as a sickness, but as a symbol, a mirror of fears and wonders. Picture a group of villagers gathered by the fire, listening to a traveling storyteller. He speaks of a knight driven mad by unrequited love, wandering the woods in despair. The listeners nod. Of course love could do that. Of course sorrow could unravel the mind. For them, it wasn't far-fetched at all. In romances and epic tales, madness often struck heroes at turning points. Knights, scholars, or kings might lose themselves to grief, then regain their senses through love, honor, or divine intervention. Madness was both danger and trial, a storm the hero had to endure before returning. Changed to the world. The fool also appeared often in stories, sometimes comic, sometimes wise. The fool's strange speech gave voice to truths others avoided. In plays, a madman could say things that a sober man could not. Truths about power, about love, about human folly. The audience laughed, but they also listened. Even medical texts included stories. Case studies of patients, real or imagined, became little narratives, teaching physicians how to recognize and treat troubled minds. A man overcome with sadness after the loss of a child. A woman who believed herself cursed. A scholar driven mad by too much study. Each story was a way of making sense of the fragile boundary between reason and unreason. And then there were the saints' lives. Many holy men and women endured visions, torments, or behaviors that today might be seen as symptoms of mental illness. But in the stories, these were signs of closeness to God, of the soul caught in a struggle with forces unseen. What looked like madness to some was sanctity to others. Literature, in this way, gave space for all kinds of minds. Madness could be tragic, comic, holy, dangerous, or even heroic. It was never just one thing. And by hearing these tales, medieval people learned to see mental struggle not only as sickness, but as part of the great tapestry of human experience. So as you rest here with the story, imagine the glow of firelight on eager faces, the hush as the storyteller speaks of sorrow and madness, love and healing. In that circle, madness was not hidden, it was shared, understood, woven into the stories that carried people through the long dark nights. Now, let's wander into the fields and festivals, because mental health in the Middle Ages wasn't only about suffering, it was also about moments of release, of joy, of shared rituals that gave troubled minds a break from their burdens. Imagine a summer fair in a medieval town. Bright banners flutter, musicians play lutes and drums, jugglers toss balls into the air, and dancers spin in circles. For a day, maybe two, life is turned upside down. The poor eat a little better, the rich mingle with the common crowd, and laughter fills the streets. For someone weighed down with sorrow, this burst of color and sound might have been medicine enough. Festivals often had fools and jesters at their center, men and women whose oddness became part of the show. Sometimes those who today we might see as mentally ill were given a role here, not hidden away but celebrated for their difference. In the topsy-turvy world of carnival, madness could be turned into laughter, strangeness into spectacle. There were also rituals meant to cleanse the mind. Pilgrimages, for example. A family might take a troubled loved one on a long walk to a distant shrine, each mile believed to chip away at the heaviness in their heart. The journey itself, the rhythm of walking, the prayers murmured, the kindness of strangers along the road, could bring a sense of calm. By the time they reached the shrine, even if the miracle did not come, the experience had already been a kind of healing. Music, too, played its role. Medieval people believed certain songs and instruments could soothe the spirit. Harps, flutes, and chants were thought to calm agitation, to ease melancholy, to lift the weary heart. Imagine lying in a darkened chamber while a soft chant echoes through the halls, the sound rolling like waves. Even today, it's not hard to feel how that could bring peace. And then there was nature itself. Gardens in monasteries, meadows outside villages, woods on the edge of towns. These were places where people went to breathe, to pray, to be still. Physicians often advised fresh air and walks for the melancholic. It might not have been a cure, but the rustle of leaves and the smell of earth could soothe troubled minds. In these ways, medieval people found balance. Their lives were hard, their remedies limited, but they knew the value of joy, music, movement, and green spaces. They wove moments of release into their calendar, giving themselves and their troubled neighbors chances to breathe. So as you sink into this story, picture the laughter of a fair, the sound of flutes drifting through a summer evening, the gentle walk of pilgrims along a dusty road. In those moments, madness softened, sorrow eased, and even the most restless minds could find a little peace. Let's turn now to the household, because not every struggle with the mind took place in churches, hospitals, or courts. Most of the time, it unfolded quietly at home, among family, neighbors, and the rhythms of daily life. Imagine a small cottage at the edge of a village. Inside, a man sits silently by the hearth, staring into the flames. He barely eats, he barely speaks. His wife tends to the children and brings him bread, coaxing him to take a bite. To her, he is simply melancholic. There may be no physician, no priest, just her patient care and the understanding of neighbors who nod knowingly. Sorrow has taken hold of him. Or think of a young woman who sometimes rants, sometimes weeps, sometimes laughs in ways that unsettle the people around her. In some villages, she might be pitied. In others, she might be feared. But often, the community simply made space. She might wander the lanes, muttering, and children might point or laugh, but still, she was part of the fabric of the town. People would say, "Ah, that's just how she is." Families bore much of the responsibility. They offered food, shelter, and protection when someone could not manage alone. There were no modern support systems, no clinics, no social workers. Care was rooted in kinship and patience. Sometimes it was loving. Sometimes, when fear or poverty pressed too hard, it was harsh. Both kindness and cruelty lived side by side. Herbal remedies were often tried at home. Mothers brewed teas of chamomile or valerian for anxious hearts. Stronger herbs like henbane or mandrake were whispered about, though used with caution, for their effects could be wild. Simple diets were prescribed, walks in fresh air, prayers said at the family altar. And let's not forget neighbors. In a close-knit medieval village, everyone knew everyone else's business. A troubled mind was not hidden behind closed doors. It was seen, shared, sometimes gossiped about, sometimes quietly helped. A neighbor might bring bread, might whisper a prayer, might simply shrug and carry on. This ordinary, everyday support was perhaps the most important. Even without grand hospitals or learned physicians, people survived through the patience of those closest to them. Mental health was lived in kitchens, fields, and village lanes woven into the daily life of family and community. As you rest here in the quiet, picture that cottage hearth, the glow of firelight on a silent figure, the gentle persistence of a family offering care in the only ways they knew. It was not perfect, but it was human, and in its own way, it kept fragile minds tethered to the world. Now let's wander into the darker corners, because while some families and communities showed patience, there were also times when fear and misunderstanding led to cruelty. Mental illness in the Middle Ages could sometimes be mistaken for sin, witchcraft, or even demonic possession, and the results could be harsh. Imagine a villager who began shouting in the night, claiming to see visions or hear voices. To his neighbors, this might not just be illness. It might feel like danger, like the work of the devil himself. Whispers could spread quickly. He is possessed. She is cursed. Something unnatural dwells in them. Fear had sharp edges, and when fear grew too strong, compassion sometimes faded. Exorcisms were one path. Priests might be called to cast out demons with holy water, chants, and rituals. Sometimes these ceremonies were meant to heal, to bring peace, but they could also be frightening, even violent, leaving the sufferer exhausted and shaken. In harsher cases, suspicion turned toward witchcraft. Women, especially those who lived alone, who behaved oddly, or who didn't fit neatly into their community, were vulnerable. If their words or actions unsettled others, they might be accused of sorcery. A sudden fit, a strange laugh, or even simple eccentricity could spark suspicion. And while not every accusation ended in tragedy, many did, with trials, punishments, and sometimes execution. Even when witchcraft wasn't the charge, madness itself could bring punishment. A disruptive person might be locked away, chained, or mocked in public. Some towns had fools' cages, iron structures where the mentally ill could be displayed for ridicule. To modern eyes it seems cruel, but to many medieval people it was a way of controlling what they could not understand. And yet, even in these darker moments, there were contradictions. The same woman accused of witchcraft might also be seen as a healer, her odd knowledge of herbs valued by neighbors. The same man mocked in public could, in another season, be treated gently by his family. Fear and care, cruelty and compassion, they coexisted in uneasy balance. So as you rest here, you can picture both sides, the quiet kindness of a family hearth, and the frightening shadows of suspicion and fear. The medieval world held both, woven together in the way people saw and treated troubled minds. As we move closer to the later Middle Ages, something interesting begins to happen. The way people thought about the mind started to shift, not all at once, but little by little. Slowly, curiosity began to grow alongside faith and fear. Scholars in universities like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford were translating ancient texts from Greek and Arabic into Latin. Works by Hippocrates, Galen, and Avicenna began to circulate again, and with them came new or rather old ideas about melancholy, hysteria, and the humors. These writings gave physicians a language to describe mental troubles that wasn't only about demons or curses. Imagine a learned doctor in a long robe, reading by candlelight, flipping through a heavy manuscript. He traces a passage that says too much black bile causes melancholy. He nods, thinking of a patient who has sat for weeks in silence, refusing food. The words on the page help him frame the problem in a way that makes sense. At least to him. Medicine did not replace religion, far from it, but it added another layer. A priest might say, pray, confess, seek God's mercy, while a physician might say, balance your humors, change your diet, let blood, if needed. For the patient, both could be true, both could be tried. Hospitals and towns began to record cases more carefully. In some cities, officials kept notes on the mentally ill, tracking who needed care, who caused trouble, and who might be dangerous. These weren't modern medical files, but they show a growing interest in understanding, classifying, and managing mental health in a more systematic way. Even in art and writing, we see hints of this shift. Illustrations show melancholic scholars with their heads resting heavily on their hands, Poets describe sadness not just as sin, but as a kind of illness of the soul. Slowly, the language of medicine, religion, and daily life began to mingle. Mental health in the Middle Ages was never simple. For some, it meant gentle prayers whispered by a monk, herbs brewed by a mother, or the steady rhythm of bells in a hospital ward. For others, it meant suspicion, exorcisms, or even accusations of witchcraft. It could bring kindness, or it could bring suffering. And yet, despite everything, medieval people did what humans have always done. They tried to make sense of troubled minds with the tools they had. They reached for explanations in demons, in humors, in stories, in God. They cared in the ways they knew how, sometimes clumsily, sometimes tenderly. If you look closely, you'll notice something familiar. Their remedies, prayer, music, nature, storytelling, family support aren't so far from what comforts us today. We might use different words, different science, but the heart of it feels the same. People need rest. They need kindness. They need to be seen and not abandoned. And maybe that's the deepest lesson here. Across centuries, across beliefs, across all the changes of history, the human mind has always been fragile, mysterious, and precious. The Middle Ages may seem distant, but in their struggles we can glimpse our own. So as you lie here now, letting the story fade into quiet, imagine the flicker of a medieval candle, the murmur of a prayer in the dark, the rustle of leaves in a monastery garden. Let those images settle like gentle shadows around you. The past has shared its story, and now it's time to rest. Good night, and may your dreams be peaceful.